Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway. It's Tuesday and it's time for another live stream. Today's topic is using trends on the Horner OCS. Now, trend graphs are a powerful tool in those process applications where you have variables that you want to monitor or control, and you're interested in seeing how those variables change over time, and you want to see that graphically. So joining me today is my colleague, Mr. Casey Gardner. How you doing today, Casey?
Hey, not too bad. How's it going,
Good.
Chuck?
So, as you describe trend graphs to new users, what are some of the highlights or unique capabilities of that feature?
Yeah, I think one mode in particular. Using trends in general, you're kind of having an expectation of being able to graph data in various forms. One mode, such as like we have a continuous scope mode, which lets you actually graph at a higher speed than you would typically expect out of most graphing capabilities. So I believe the lowest you can do in terms of an update rate is around 10 milliseconds, which is, again, for fast process data would be really important to see in a visual display for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, typically with most applications, for SCADA or for HMI, when you think of trending, you're thinking of data maybe once per second. And with the traditional trend setup in a Horner product, you're going to be looking at similar times. But with that scope object, that's one of the setup options for the trend. With that scope option, you can look at data much more quickly. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Now, this particular program isn't live today. Our travel schedule this month is kind of crazy. So therefore, please still ask questions, but go ahead and ask them through the comment section, and we'll get those answered in non-real time, but as quickly as we can. Okay, let's get going. Here's our agenda for today, and it's really pretty simple. We're going to talk a little bit about what trend graphs are. Then we're going to go through all of the various varieties of trend graphs you can use in the Horner OCS. We'll talk a little bit about how you can store that trend data to microSD for recall later on the screen, or just for logging purposes overall. And of course, we'll have demonstrations for you to see how it all works. All right, trend graphs. What are trend graphs? Well, as far as the OCS is concerned, trend graphs are a graphical object that can be configured to display the value of variables over time in graphical form. And the object is really designed to replicate to a certain extent the functionality of chart recorders that you see there on the right. Now, the variable values that are graphed are sampled at a pre-configured interval. And one of the differences between the different types of graphs or different types of trends that are supported in the OCS are basically the sampling interval. That's one of the main differences. Now, once you've selected a sample interval and completely configured your trend graph and it's running at runtime, the data is shown in real time for the most recent samples. Okay? Now, there are 4 different types of trend graphs in the OCS. We have standard trends, which basically can sample data as fast as ones per second. Now, standard trends can run in the background. What does that mean? Well, it basically means that whether or not a trend is being displayed at any given moment or not, with a standard trend, you can configure it to be trending in the background. So if you want a trend graph to always be trending data or sampling data every time the machine runs, regardless of whether the operator is looking at the trend graph or not, then using a standard trend, you can do that. So for instance, you could use the machine run contact as your enable for the trend, and then if that machine is running, then the trend is taking data. And then when the operator goes to look at that trend, the data will be there, okay? Because it will have been trending in the background. Now, standard trends cannot retain data on power down, okay? So that's a standard trend. They can work in the background. You can sample data as fast as ones per second. However, when you power down, all your data is lost, okay? So on power up, a trend starts from scratch. That's a standard trend. What about a retentive trend? Well, a retentive trend is just about identical to a standard trend, but the only difference is that data is retained on power down. Okay, makes sense, right? Retentive trend. And then one other main difference, and that is with a retentive trend, you can choose to store the data that is trended to micro SD, and then that data can be recalled later. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail here in a couple minutes. Okay, now let's talk about a couple of other trends, which we call snapshot scope and continuous scope. Now, with snapshot scopes, these are trend graphs that can sample data as fast as every 10 milliseconds. So they operate on a much faster basis, or they can operate on a much faster basis than a trend, which can only sample data every second. However, there are some limitations. Snapshot scopes cannot run in the background, and basically they run to the max number of samples, however many samples are covered in the graph itself. Those are shown on the screen, and then as soon as those samples are shown on the screen, the trend stops, or the scope stops. And then data is not retained on power down. So with a snapshot scope, you're only going to be able to see the data when that screen is displayed. It can't be operating in the background. And they do require a start button effectively to start them whenever you want to take the data. And then it's going to take the number of samples that are covered by the graph and freeze. Now let's talk about a continuous scope. How does that vary from a snapshot scope? Well, the main difference is that with a continuous scope, as soon as the data fills up on the graph itself, it will continue going and it will scroll. Okay? It can take data not quite as fast as a snapshot scope. In other words, every 50 milliseconds instead of as fast as every 10 milliseconds. Just like a snapshot, it can't run in the background. Okay, and data is not retained on power down, but it'll run to the max number of samples and then scroll. All right, let's talk about how many trend objects you can use in any given OCS project. Okay, well, the limitation really isn't in the number of trend graphs itself for the whole project. The limit really is in what we call the number of pens. Now, for any one given trend, you could have as many as 4 pens being graphed simultaneously on that trend graph. All right. And then for your total project, the number of pens is going to be the limitation. So for example, with a micro OCS, you've got a limit of 16 pens total. So that could be 16 trend graphs, 1 pen per trend. It could be 4 trend graphs with 4 pens each, or any combination that adds up to 16 pens. The X5 is more limited because with the X5, it has a little different memory structure. So it doesn't have quite as much memory in general, and it doesn't have enough memory for trends. So it's limited to 4 pens total. The XLE and XLT, just like the Micro series, are also limited at 16 pens. And then from the XL series, XL4 on up, you've got a total of 64 pens available with that product line. Okay, let's talk about how you configure a trend. We'll start with going to the screen editor. Trends are graphic objects. You have to go to the screen editor to use them. You'll click on the trend icon, which I'm showing there here on the screen, and then you use your mouse to click, holding it down, and then dragging on the screen to size the trend, how big you want it to be. Now keep in mind, once you've dropped that trend object on the screen, you can resize it without any problem later. Next, you need to configure a trigger variable for that trend, okay? And that trigger variable determines when will the trend start. Okay, so let's say you've got a snapshot scope or a continuous scope. You're going to need to use some sort of button on the screen or something similar to start that trend. And it should be, in the case of a button on the screen, it should be a toggle switch, because you're going to want to turn that variable on and leave it on. Okay? So it should be a toggle, not a momentary. Now, let's say you've got a trend like a standard trend or a retentive trend that you want to be continuously trending in the background. And when I say continuous, I mean always. Well, in that case, you could use, as your trigger, you could use the always on contact. That way, if an OCS is in run mode, that trend is active and trending, even if it's not being displayed at any given moment. Okay, so in addition to configuring a trigger variable, which could be always on in the case of standard or retentive trends, or it could be a button on the screen, for instance, with scopes. In addition to that, you need to configure the type of trend you're talking about among the 4 different types, as well as the sample rate. How frequently is that trend object going to be sampling data? And again, that's going to vary in terms of the fastest it can be. It's going to vary based on the trend type. And those limits are shown there on the screen, and I talked about those already as well. Okay. Next, you need to configure your pens. What are you configuring with your pens? Well, the big thing is you're going to be configuring the variable specifically that is going to be trended. Now, there could be just one variable, going to have at least one, or it could be as many as 4. All right? Now, the variables need to be integer type variables. Okay, we don't give you the ability to directly trend real type variables, for instance, using a trend object. Now, when Seascape 10 comes out and we have some newer model OCSs that are available, we're going to give you some more flexible capabilities there. But for the current version of Seascape and the current OCS products, you are limited to integer type data to be trended. Let's say you do have floating point data that you want to trend. What do I need to do? Well, you simply are going to need to do a little bit of logic in your ladder program that's going to effectively do a type change from real to integer, and then basically you're going to be trending the integer. All right, so that's effectively what you need to do. Okay, in addition to assigning the variables, and there can be up to 4, but at least 1, you also, of course, for every variable or every pen, you're going to assign its color and whether it needs to be a solid line, a dotted line, or a dashed line. Okay, so that's pen configuration. All right, next we're going to do axis configuration, or we're going to configure the properties of the axis. Now for the x-axis, the things we're going to configure are the title, the data range, whether it's in seconds or minutes or hours, whatever the case may be. You're also going to configure the number of tick marks on that axis visually, so it'll look the way you want. And then, of course, you're going to configure a title for that axis if you're going to actually use that. For the y-axis, again, a title. For the y-axis, that's where you need to fill in the scaling, okay? And in the one you see on the screen there, it's scaled from 0 to 100. And remember, these are always integers, so the min and the max are going to be integer values. And of course, in addition to the title and the scaling, do you want the data range to be shown or not? And also the number of tick marks for the y-axis as well. And then finally at the bottom, you've got a display grid lines option where you can decide if you want to display grid lines on the trend or not. All right, now let's talk a little bit about how many samples left to right will be shown on your trend. Okay, well, the number of samples left to right will be equal to the number of pixels in the width of the data display area. So in the bottom left-hand corner where the X and the Y-axis meet there, Seascape will show a couple numbers separated by a comma. The first number is how wide the display area of the graph is. In this example on the screen, it's 734 pixels. What that basically means is there is 1 pixel per sample, And therefore, this particular trend is going to show the last 734 samples on the screen because there's 1 pixel assigned per sample from left to right. Okay? Now that second number of 413, that simply is just showing basically how many pixels top to bottom in the data display area are available. Now that doesn't really impact anything. If my scaled value of my y-axis is 0 to 1,000, as I've configured in the axis properties, Seascape is going to scale those vertical values appropriately for the min and the max that I've configured in my axis properties. But that 413 number there in the case of this particular graph is being shown for convenience purposes. Okay, now let's talk about one additional aspect that's available for retentive trends, and that is history. With retentive trends, you have the ability to select that you want to support history. And the area highlighted in the red box there is shown on the screen. So if you enable that capability, now you need to specify a file name, and it's actually not really a file name per se, it's more of a directory name. Okay, so I've shown there in that example that I want a directory called PSI_data to be created by the OCS. Within that directory is where all the history files will be stored. And those history files are going to be in CSV format, and the name of the files within that directory are going to be based on time and date, so they're unique in their file name. Now, why do they need to be unique in their file name? Well, that's because it's not just one ginormous file that's created by the OCS, but the OCS will create an hourly file if the sample rate for your trend graph is in seconds, and it will create a new file every day if the sample rate is in minutes or hours. All right? And then you've got a couple more options in addition to the historical support and the directory name. You've also got the ability to decide whether you want the operator to be able to recall that data and select a starting time and an ending time for that data that can then be shown on the screen. Okay, so that's another option there. So if you just want the data not only to be trended but also to be stored to a CSV file, then you would just check that first option. If you want the operator to be able to go back in time and select a start and end date and then view the results of that on the screen, then you could select one of the next two or both. Okay? Okay, next we're going to do our demonstration of the different types of trend graphs in the OCS. So let's go ahead and start in Seascape. Now what I have done here is I have created a project where I'm showing you basically the different types of trend graphs in the same demo project. So I'm here in Seascape. Trend graphs are part of the graphical features in the OCS, so you need to go to the graphics editor. All right, and as you can see here, I've set up a bit of a navigation system to switch between the different trend graphs. All right, so let's start with a screen that has two of the scope objects, one that's snapshot and one that's continuous. So what you have here, this obviously is a snapshot scope as I have it labeled. And I've also got, for each of these scopes, I have a toggle switch that I have overlaid over the top of the graph. So this isn't built into the graph, this is overlaid over the top of the graph. And remember, the scope type trends do not operate in the background. So you don't normally set them up to be triggered by the always on variable. You normally would trigger them with some sort of push button. In this case, I have overlaid a toggle switch on top of each of these trend objects that are configured as a scope. All right, let's see how they're actually configured. So I'm going to double click here on this particular trend graph. You can see first my trigger. So my trigger variable is called scope start, and that's the one that's actually tied to that toggle switch that I overlaid over the top of the graph. Okay, you can see I have selected snapshot scope with a sample rate of 100 milliseconds. All right, now let's go take a look at the pens. Remember, pens is where we configure not only the color and the line style for that particular variable, but also where we assign the variable for each pen. Now for this particular graph and for all the graphs in this demo today, I've decided only to show one variable per graph. I could show up to 4. So if you want to add additional variables or additional pens to a graph, you need to increment the pen number, enable each one that you want to enable, assign the variable, select your color and your line type. But again, in this case, I have a single variable called pressure 1 on pen number 1 drawn in red and a solid line. Okay, so that's the pen properties for this graph. Next, let's look at axis properties. Axis properties is where we can configure things like the title of each axis. I've configured for the x-axis time in seconds. I've also selected a time frame of seconds. The OCS automatically calculates based on the width of the trend graph how many seconds will be on the graph itself. All right, I've chosen 5 tick marks, and that is including the origin. I've got 5 tick marks along the x-axis, so that's the configuration for the x-axis. Y-axis is similar. I've configured the title here, which is called pressure, and I've chosen not to show the data range for the y-axis. Now, you also have to configure for the y-axis the actual range or the scale of the range, and for this particular variable, I'm choosing 0 to 1000. Okay? Now, getting back to the particular pens here, now one thing I want to mention, I'll go back into the pen configuration. The variables have to be integers here. Seascape does not currently have the capability of directly trending a real variable, for instance. However, if you do have a real variable you want to trend, it's not that big of a deal. You're just going to, in your logic, you're going to create a new integer-based variable and then effectively convert your real variable over to an integer, maybe do some scaling if that's what you need to do, and then draw that particular variable as in its integer form. Okay, so that's what you would do if you have a real variable that you want to trend. You need to create an integer version of that first and trend that variable. Okay, so that's how we've drawn this snapshot scope. And remember, snapshot scopes can be sampling as fast as every 10 milliseconds. I have chosen 100 milliseconds here. Okay, next let's take a look at this continuous scope, which frankly is set up almost identically. Okay, the only difference really is we have configured it as a continuous scope. Now with continuous scopes, you can sample as fast as every 50 milliseconds. I've chosen that same 100 millisecond rate that I chose for the snapshot version of this graph. Everything else is the same, okay? The only difference is on the pen side, even though I am drawing the same variable, I've chosen a different pen color. Okay, that's really the only difference. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like on the OCS itself. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and navigate to the screen containing these graphs. You'll notice that they didn't start drawing right away. They're basically just sitting here. Now, remember, with scope objects or scope trends, they do not draw or trend in the background or even take data in the background. They have to be in the foreground, and they have to be triggered. So I'm going to go ahead and trigger these here. And you'll see once I do that, they start drawing and filling in the data based on their sample rate from left to right. Now, they look identical other than the pen color. The only difference you'll see actually when they do finally fill up here in a few seconds. What will happen on the snapshot scope is you'll see the data fill up all the way from left to right, and then you'll see it's going to freeze, okay? With a continuous scope, the data will fill up and then it will scroll. Okay, so now that that's happened, you can see the difference between these two. So snapshot on the left, continuous on the right. Snapshot can sample as fast as every 10 milliseconds. Continuous can sample as fast as every 50 milliseconds. In this case, they're both sampling at 100 milliseconds. Okay, so that is the snapshot scope and the continuous scope. Okay, back to Seascape. All right, now let's take a look at the next type of trend graphs, and that would be either a standard or a retentive trend. I've drawn on this screen a standard trend. Okay, now with a standard trend, the sample rate is considerably slower. The fastest you can go is every second. All right, and that's how I have configured it. With a standard trend, it can trend in the background or sample data in the background. And so it's not unusual to use the always on variable as the trigger for a standard or a retentive trend, which is what I've done here. Okay, now under configure pens, I've again chosen only a single variable for this graph. I could have up to 4. I've chosen a variable called temperature with a green pen color and a solid line. If I wanted additional variables, I would increment the pen number, enable the pen, and add the variable color and line style. Okay, so that is my properties for my pen. Axis properties, I've done this very similarly as the way I did the scope objects. The same kind of title as I've done, the same title on the x-axis, the same seconds scale. Now this one is, because it's a wider graph, it can show up to 10 seconds in this case, or I'm sorry, minutes, all right? I should probably give you the right information here. So yes, I've decided minutes is my time scale, and the total number of pixels wide means that I can have a total of 10 minutes here. All right. Now, on the y-axis, the scaling is different in this case. So for this particular graph, I've gone with 0 to 100 as the scaling for my variable. And again, I've selected grid lines here. Okay, so that is the setup for my standard trend. Let's take a look at the next screen where I've drawn a graph very similarly, but slightly different. So this is a retentive trend. Okay, where I have selected historic support. Okay, so what's the difference between a standard trend and a retentive trend? The standard trend and the retentive trend can both trend in the background. They both very often use the always on variable to enable that trending to happen all the time. But with a standard trend, when you power down, all data is lost. With a retentive trend, when you power down, you retain the data. And then when you power back up again, you'll see a vertical dashed line that indicates there was a break in the data because of the power down. Also with the retentive trend, you have the ability to enable historic support. And we've done that here. So when I enable historic support, I need to specify a directory on the micro SD card where this historically logged trend data will be logged, and that will be logged in the form of CSV files in this directory. Okay, now the files themselves will have their name based on time and date, and they will be housed inside this directory. When I say file names, what do I mean there? Well, it's the historic trend data is not stored in a single ginormous CSV file, but based on how often we are trending, the OCS will create a new CSV file every hour or every day. Because we're trending as fast as every second, it's going to create a new CSV file every hour. And that file will be housed within this directory. Okay, now the enable replay choice means that as an operator, I have the ability to press what's called a pause button and then go press an open button to select a different or a previous time and date of samples for a start and an end date, and then the OCS will bring that data up from the CSV file and display it on the screen. Okay, so that's what the replay support is all about. The cursor support basically means that if I want to pause the graph and point at any particular sample or move my finger along the graph to see a series of samples, at every sample, it will show a cursor along with the time and the date of that sample. Okay, so this is retentive trend with history. All right, let's take a look at what this looks like on the OCS itself. All right, so I'm still looking at my scope here. You can still see the continuous scope is scrolling. I'll head back to my main menu and let's take a look at my standard trend. Now, you can see that it immediately was full of data when we switched to this screen. That's because it was trending in the background. And it's continuing to scroll here. And I can't touch the screen and nothing really happens. There's nothing going on here. There's no cursor enabled for this particular trend. And again, it's a standard trend and not a retentive trend. Let me go ahead and now take a look at the retentive trend with history. Now on the surface, it looks nearly identical. The data's there right away. It's actively scrolling. The only difference is we now have controls buttons on the bottom of the graph, okay? So I can go ahead and pause. And now if I touch the screen and scroll along the data points, I will actually get the date and the time of that particular sample, all right? And if I press the open button, I can even select from the past a time and date for a start and a time and date for an end for data that I want to examine on the screen, and it will call it up. I'm going to go ahead and skip this for now. But if I were to select that, the OCS would grab the data from the memory card and then show that here on the screen. And again, I would still have my cursor capability available there. All right. Okay, and then when I press the play button, it returns to showing live data. All right, so that's retentive trend with history. Okay, so that concludes the material I wanted to present to you today. All right, and I want to remind you that we're available every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, usually for a live session with live Q&A at the end. Because we're not live today, our travel schedule is just crazy this month. You have the option of asking questions, but please do so in the comment section, and then we'll answer those questions in non-real time, but quickly. Okay, we'll get to those just as quick as we can. And again, we're here every Tuesday at 2 o'clock. And you can always watch our sessions live or on replay, either on our YouTube channel or on the Horner website. We're right in the middle of a series of sessions that we started at the beginning of October that's running through early November. You can see the topics here. All right, we've covered about half of them now. And then next week, we'll be covering a fun topic. It's going to be WebMI on the Micro OCS. The Micro OCS is our very functional entry-level line of controllers. WebMI is a feature that allows you to remotely monitor and control your application from a web browser, either on a mobile device or on a computer. So don't miss next week's show as we go through and show you every step of the way how to use that feature with the Micro OCS product line. I'd also like to remind you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If you subscribe to our channel and you select notifications, you'll get a notification when we go live, as well as whenever we post a pre-recorded video. Okay, so we look forward to joining you next week to talk WebMI and the Micro OCS. Until then, stay safe. Thanks again.